Ladies and gentlemen, the Kids in the Room podcast. Kids in the Room podcast.
That's right. That's right.
Brought to you by Move Faces TV. Let's go.
Woo! All right. Hey guys, woo! Welcome to the Kids in the Room podcast. Today we got Avi here, who is a professor at Harvard and an amazing person. Avi, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Oh yes. Definitely great to have you here. I've definitely been researching and looking up a lot of your stuff, and I was just amazed at some of the conversations that you had with other people, and I wanted to bring you on. Yeah.
My pleasure. You know, my day started at 4:30 a.m. I usually jog at 5 a.m. and in the company of birds, ducks, rabbits, and wild turkeys. And that's how my day starts every day now.
Wow. So are you doing like a lot of hunting and things like that, or like?
No. It's just that I live in an area where there are woods nearby, and I just enjoy jogging in nature. I enjoy nature much more than the company of people, actually.
I think the older we get, that kinds of happens. It kinds of tend to happen with us as humans.
Well, I also don't have any footprint on social media. That's a condition that my wife posed when I met her, and I agreed to that. And I see the wisdom now because it keeps me sort of
grounded,
thinking
or?
independently, and I don't need to. I don't pay too much attention to the audience. I keep my eyes on the ball, so to speak.
That's always a good perspective. The wife is definitely a great person. So I kind of wanted to, dig in and bring you on and talk a little bit about your background, kind of, your book and how you've gotten to where you are and things like that. So to kick it off, let's talk about the book Extraterrestrial.
Right. So this was my most recent book. And in fact, I have another book coming out in a couple of months, and that is Life in the Cosmos. So it's a textbook. It will be more than 1,000 pages, talking about the science associated with the search for life, which I regard as the most exciting frontier in science, trying to find whether we are alone or not, whether there is a smarter kid on the block. That's a fundamental question. We are born into this world like actors put on a stage without a script. We don't know what the play is about. The first question to ask is, are there other actors? If there are, maybe we can ask them what the play is about. And for me, it's really interesting to ask whether we are the smartest kid on the block. Because we can, if not, then we can learn from other civilizations out there in space. And we know that the sun is a latecomer, that most of the stars formed billions of years before the sun, and there are lots of stars out there. Billions of stars like the sun in the Milky Way galaxy alone, and they have about half of them have a planet the size of the Earth, roughly at the same separation. So very likely there were civilizations that predated us, that looked just like us, that we are as common as ants are on a sidewalk, and to me, it's this sense of modesty that guides me and allows me to ask the question, can we look for relics that they left behind in space? And, my book is about one such object that is the first one that was discovered close to Earth, that came from outside the solar system, and it looked very weird. It was so weird that I suggested maybe it's artificial. It's just like the experience of finding a plastic bottle on the beach among all the rocks and seashells that you find there that are naturally produced. So I asked this question, and that's what the book is about.
And what do you find so unique about this object within the sky? What makes it possibly extraterrestrial versus just a random object, a meteorite or comet or whatever it may be, right?
Right. So all the objects we've seen before from inside the solar system, it's sort of like our backyard. They were all rocks that were, some of them were covered with ice. And when they got close to the sun, the ice warmed up and evaporated, and we saw a cometary tail. So they looked like a comet. So either comets or asteroids, and they were all rocks. And this object was definitely not a comet because it had no tail. There was no gas or dust around it. But then there was a force pushing it away from the sun, in addition to the force of gravity that dictated its orbit. And the only sense I could make of it is it's because of the reflection of sunlight that it's getting pushed away. And in September 2020, there was another object that we found that was pushed away from the sun by reflecting sunlight, and it didn't have any cometary tail. Was given the name 2020 SO, and it turned out to be a rocket booster from a 1966 mission to the moon. So we know that we produced that object. It had very thin walls, and therefore it had a lot of area for its mass, and that's why it was pushed away as a result of reflecting sunlight. So we know that it's artificial, 2020 SO, but we don't know who produced this object from 2017, the one that is called Oumuamua, because it was discovered in Hawaii. And Oumuamua in the Hawaiian language means a scout. So we don't know who produced Oumuamua. Nature doesn't produce very thin objects like you need in order to get a push away from the sun by reflecting sunlight.
Right. So therefore, it might be
It
extraterrestrial
might be
or some type of
artificial, yes.
intelligent. Hmm.
It might be artificial. And I should say, there were scientists that suggested maybe it's of a natural origin, but all of these suggestions invoked something that we've never seen before. Like, for example, a chunk of frozen hydrogen, like the size of a football field. And that doesn't make sense because it will get evaporated very quickly. So it won't survive the journey, even though we can't see the cometary tail of hydrogen because hydrogen is transparent. That's not a viable suggestion. And there was a suggestion maybe it's a cloud of dust particles that are held together very loosely, and it's 100 times less dense than air, and therefore it gets pushed by reflecting sunlight because it's so lightweight, like a feather. But the problem with that is it will get heated by hundreds of degrees when it gets close to the sun. It wouldn't maintain its integrity. Then there was a suggestion maybe it's a nitrogen iceberg, sort of chipped off the surface of a planet like Pluto. And the problem with that is you need a lot of Plutos. You need altogether, you need more mass by a factor of 100 than you have in stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So it's just untenable in terms of the amount of mass you need to make so many chunks of frozen nitrogen so that one of them will be seen by our telescope. So there were suggestions, but for natural origin, but all of them had the major flaws. And I say that, if they all talk about something we've never seen before, then why not consider an artificial origin?
Wow. I mean, totally makes sense. And another thing too, I wanted to add is you also mentioned that in Hawaii that this was first detected. Was this like I think there's one big type of like air or mechanism called is it called the ear of God? Is that what it is? Where it's like listening to the stars. Like, how did you guys locate this? What do you mean you guys discovered it in Hawaii? Like, how? What was going on?
Right. It's just because Hawaii is a fantastic place to observe the sky because it has very good weather and the atmosphere is not blurring what you're looking at. And so there are many telescopes in Hawaii. And of course, there are traditions in Hawaii. And it's interesting that many important discoveries about the universe were made on those mountains that have significance to the local population. And but at any event, there is a very good survey telescope there on Mount Haleakala in Maui that I actually visited a few months before this object was discovered. And it's a beautiful sight. You are sort of above the clouds, and it's a magnificent view to walk on that mountain. I really loved Hawaii when I visited it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, definitely. I haven't actually been to Hawaii just yet. I definitely need to go so I can check out some of
Well,
these.
each
sites.
island is different than the other, and you should visit all of them if you have a chance.
Oh, sure, I will.
I should say this object that was found, the experience of it looking so strange is just like finding a plastic bottle on the beach, among all the rocks and seashells that are naturally produced that we often find.
Hmm. So in that way, are you saying you said it's like almost like a plastic bottle or something like that, or material is in that right?
Well,
You're saying comparables?
in the sense that most of the time in the past, we always found natural objects, rocks. And that's what you find when you walk on the beach most of the time. But every now and then you may stumble across a plastic bottle and it gives you an important message that there is a civilization out there that produced it. And in space, we sent out Voyager 1, Voyager 2, New Horizons outside of the solar system. And you can imagine that if there were other civilizations, they sent out equipment into space. And by now, billions of years later, it's space trash. It's not functional necessarily, but we can find evidence that they exist. Even if those civilizations are dead, the the equipment they sent out is out there.
Yeah, totally. I get it. I mean, so are you saying that you think maybe an ancient alien civilization maybe already passed away or dead or just or
Yeah, I think most of the stars formed billions of years before the sun, and if they had a similar history of a technological civilization forming around them, just like we did around the sun, those civilizations predated us. They existed billions of years before we came to exist, and by now they may be dead, either because the star, died, or even for us, within a billion years from now, the sun will boil off all the oceans on Earth, so we cannot stay on Earth. It will be impossible to sustain the life that we have. We will have to move into other worlds, other planets, or build platforms in space. It took us about 100,000 years to move from Africa, from the jungles, into apartment buildings in cities. It took 100,000 years, and we adapted. It's a very different environment to live in an apartment building than being in the jungle. But moving to space is not so much of a leap. Going from an apartment building to space is a transition, but we can adapt to that in 100,000 years. So the way I think of this is, we are currently having a lifestyle on the surface of the Earth, but in the future, we might very well venture into space, and we should start thinking about it. So, there are people thinking about going to the moon and going to Mars, and I think it's important not to keep all of our eggs in one basket, because if something catastrophic happens to Earth, the way we are now, we will lose everything that is precious to us. It will be a single point catastrophe, a single planet catastrophe. But if we spread over various locations, we can preserve some of what we hold dear to us.
right? Totally. I definitely agree. But let's say we move to Mars, right? We move to Mars, right? The sun starts to get really hot. Starts boiling Earth's oceans. You know, what about Mars? Does Mars ocean not boil at the same time? Are we safe once we get to Mars?
Well, Mars is a little bit farther, so it will take more time before Mars will not be habitable. The best thing to do is establish some platform in space, artificial, just like the space station, but more sophisticated, like that can provide us with everything we need. And then we can arrange our distance from the sun to be just the right distance, so that we don't either burn up or freeze, And that is something to think about in terms of an engineering project. Uh, it's there is this story in the Old Testament, in the Bible, about Noah's Ark,
Yeah.
where Noah tried to preserve animals from the great flood and built an ark to put them in it. I think we should contemplate the same in the future. We should build a spaceship that will carry everything we care about. Now, it doesn't mean we need to put elephants, whales on that spaceship. We can just put the information in their DNA into a computer system and have a 3D printer that maybe will be able to produce those animals on another planet, in another location, once we figure out how to make synthetic life. So it's something to think about for the distant future, how to preserve, there was this Gutenberg printing press about 600 years ago that prior to it, there were a very small number of copies of the Bible, and each of them was very precious. But once the printing press produced a lot of copies, any single point catastrophe wasn't really, endangering all the content that was in those Bible copies of the Bible. So in much the same spirit, if we produce copies of what we care about here on Earth and place them in other locations, we would avoid a single planet catastrophe.
Right, some type of like mass extinction to actually, we definitely want to avoid that. I mean, all the
Well,
work
it
and stuff
happened,
we've done.
the dinosaurs, 66 million years ago, the dinosaurs were very big. They were dominant relative to their environment. And they were very arrogant. They thought, oh, nothing can happen to us. They ate their grass and enjoyed it. But then 66 million years ago, a giant rock the size of Manhattan Island hit the ground, and the fun stopped at that point because 3/4 of all species on Earth, life forms on Earth, went extinct. And the ego trip of the dinosaurs abruptly was tarnished, and so this is an important lesson. For a while you can think very highly about your ability to survive everything, but then something catastrophic can happen.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And even when you bring those things up, I think like, who's to say that this hasn't been like a replay of something that already did this already? Because I mean, you find a planet, your planet has a bunch of mistakes. You store up a bunch of DNA or whatever it may be, and you go see a planet. Okay, it looks habitable. You know what? I just throw a meteorite or whatever because at a certain point we're definitely smart enough to do so. Now all of the dinosaurs or whatever we think that are harmful are pretty much gone, and now we can just go in there and put up shop, just like we do when we, tear down a house or we go tear down to, the Amazon or woods and things like that, and we put our own type of things. We have these ways of making things happen and, kind of like eliminating all the other stuff that was there prior to make it more user or human
Yeah, so
friendly.
that's exactly the plan for Mars that some people talk about. It's called
Terraforming?
terraforming Mars.
Yeah.
Basically creating right now Mars is not really habitable because it has no atmosphere. It used to have in the first couple of billion of years, and in early Mars there could have been life, and that's what the Perseverance rover is searching for. Evidence for life that existed in the early Mars, but Mars lost its atmosphere and all the oceans evaporated. You can't have liquid water on the surface of a planet without an atmosphere. You need to have an atmosphere. So the idea is to maybe recreate an atmosphere around Mars and terraform it. It's called terraforming Mars, and so that we can inhabit it again. And people are thinking about doing that, but of course you destroy everything that might be out there, all the pristine conditions, and you never know. I mean, it's just like as you said, once you go to a place and establish your own rule there, you might actually destroy what was there to start with. And people that are naturalists, that they don't want to harm nature. Actually, there was a very famous one here next to where I live called Henry Thoreau. He went to spend a year near the Walden Pond and wrote a book called Walden, where he argued that we should leave nature intact. We shouldn't change nature. And if you apply the same thing to other planets, you would argue that we should never dominate another planet and change conditions on it. But of course, humans have other ambitions, and we did not follow Thoreau's advice here on Earth. We built big cities. We changed the environment, and maybe now it comes to haunt us in the form of global warming. That's one. Maybe he was wise to tell us not to do that.
I mean, I think that has some merit to it. But at the same time, aren't we a part of nature in itself? I think there's a question of what is nature, right? We're a part of nature. Nature made us. So it's like, are we parasites to planets? Like what are we? You know what I mean? It's like when you keep on digging, you
No,
keep
that's
on
a good
going.
point.
It's like, could we be the
That's a
could
good
we be the parasites? You know?
Yeah, that's a good point. But we are different than animals in the sense that we change our environment much more than they do. We are able, with our technologies, we produce nuclear weapons, we produce pollution of the atmosphere at a level that no other animal can accomplish. And as a result, we feel more responsible for what is happening around us, and that's the distinguishing feature. And I frankly, I really like nature left on its own. I enjoy watching it when I jog every morning. And I would be very happy just living my life without changing nature. But that's not the way human nature is, And the fact that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have plans to go to Mars already tells you that in the long term there would be a commercial interest in going to space, and we cannot prevent that.
Right. I mean, we have so much history, we're discovering, and we still don't know much about our ancient ancestors. I mean, did they reach a point, or did some of them reach a point where they, in some type of secluded, surroundings, where they built some type of like, spacecraft, and did they already take off? Did they go to the stars, and that was secluded within that, that community, and then
Well,
left
that's
whatever they
that's
left?
a, that's an interesting question because humans, at least the evidence we have is that humans started about 1 million years ago, a little more than 1 million years ago, and uh, these are the Homo sapiens, and so that's a relatively short time in the history of Earth. And you can ask, is it possible that there was a technological civilization that predated Homo sapiens that maybe existed 1 billion years ago, and even if they left computer terminals on the surface, geological activity would have mixed up those computer terminals with the interior of the Earth, and we wouldn't find any evidence for that in archaeological digs today. It is possible, and some people suggested searching for such things. We don't have any clues that that happened. One thing to keep in mind about the moon, for example, is if there was a civilization from Earth that landed on the moon and left some equipment there, we could find it because the moon doesn't have any geological activity. Everything that is left on the surface of the moon stays there. There is no mixing. And as a result, if we ever establish a sustainable base on the moon, we can do some archaeology there and search around and see if there is any equipment that was left behind.
Right. And then, a thing is like, so you're basically saying on the moon, things wouldn't decompose?
Yes, that's right. There is no atmosphere to the moon, and also there is no geological activity. These are two things that we have on Earth that basically destroy evidence from billions of years ago. And on the moon, nothing much happens. The only thing that happens is that small dust and small rocks hit the moon every now and then. And actually, the surface of the moon is covered with pieces of rock that are very sharp. You can easily get cut if you just touch the dust on the surface of the moon because nothing happens to it. There is no wind, there is no atmosphere. You don't rub pieces against each other. Only when something hits the surface of the moon, it breaks up. That's all. And so you have these small pieces that are extremely sharp, then you can get cut very easily if you were to touch them with unprotected hands.
Wow, that's deep and interesting. Or, it's also another question is like, I think you can always go deeper with this, but like at some point, could technology, put us in some type of like, crossroads where there's like this, I don't know, almost a magical realm or a spiritual realm where there's, multiple universes, or there's certain energies that you can use to do certain things. Are there things that possibly we haven't discovered, in our time that could, catapult us as far as like time travel and things like that, and technology that we have may not found or discovered, but we've gotten all these other things, but maybe a prior civilization figured out a couple of things that we didn't.
Yeah, so that's the benefit from learning more about other civilizations because maybe they're much more advanced. They were much more advanced than we are. And as a result, we can learn from them. If we are not the smartest kid on the block, we can learn. And although, some people would prefer to, be the smartest, I think it's actually a benefit for us to find out if we can learn from them. And that there are various ways to do that. One is through an encounter where they teach us, kind of. Another is from finding equipment that they left in space and realizing, wow, this is a technology we don't possess. It's way in the future of our technological development. So why don't we try to import it? And it's possible that we know very little right now, that we have an island of knowledge, but it's in an ocean of ignorance. And some of the things you talked about, maybe a time machine or some, maybe these are concepts that are doable. After a million years you develop that knowledge, but right now, because we are at the beginning, we only had 100 years of science and technology, we are relatively ignorant, and one way to find out how ignorant we are is to look for others. When my daughters were infant, they tended to be at home and they thought that they are the smartest and they are the center of the world. But when they went to the kindergarten, they met other kids and realized that there are smarter kids around. And our civilization will mature once we meet others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing, right? And there's something I always kind of, I always kind of say, the person who thinks he's the smartest person is usually the dumbest person, and the person who thinks he's the dumbest person is usually the smartest person, right? I mean, because usually
That's a good point.
the smartest person normally is has an ego, and that doesn't allow you to be humble, and that doesn't allow you to learn and to think about things that you may have not thought of. And as humans, we're not actually as smart as we think we are, and sometimes we come to these conclusions, and our egos get mixed into it, and
Right.
we grab these things from our our civilization that give us these brandings or leverage to say that we're this or we're that, and so therefore we have a voice and we're somebody who has authority over reason and knowledge over others. When you dig down to it, it doesn't matter. You can learn something from a homeless person or a person sitting on an island who may not have these type of prestigious backgrounds, and you'd be amazed, you'd be humbled. And I think it's like always sit down and listen to kind of people who you might think you can't learn from.
Well, I completely agree with you. And I think the one thing I learned from studying astronomy for decades is a sense of modesty, And uh, first of all, we are so small relative to the universe. But also we live just for a short amount of time, a short fraction out of the history of the universe. And so we are not so significant, and we are not at the center of the stage. There are so many things happening out there that um, you have to assume that we are not privileged in any way. If you go back to in human history, people tended to think that we are the center of the world. That's what Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, argued, and people believed him for 1,000 years because it was flattering to their ego. But then Copernicus and Galileo realized, no, actually the Earth moves around the sun. And at first, the philosophers didn't want to look through Galileo's telescope because they said, we know the sun moves around the Earth and it violates what we believe in. But that didn't matter. The Earth continued to move around the sun. And so the lesson from that is we are not at a privileged place. We are not at the center. And then we realize, oh, the Earth-Sun system is not special in any way, because half of the sun-like stars have a planet the size of the Earth, roughly at the same separation. We now know that from the Kepler satellite data. And as a result, not only that we are not at the center of the universe, but also the Earth-Sun system is very common. We are not privileged in having a sun-like star next to us at the right distance. So I would say, nature gives us this message again and again. You are not privileged. You're not supposed to think that you're special or unique. And people still retreat to this notion, oh, maybe we are the only intelligent beings out there. And I find that arrogant, frankly. I think, we should just assume that a lot of things like us existed in the past, and we are not, let's just search for them. But instead, this subject is being ridiculed by many scientists, by the mainstream of scientific community. And it's a taboo. There is a taboo on discussing it, which I think is very unfortunate, because we have now the telescopes and the instruments to search for technological signatures of other civilizations. And, I think really the root of all evil in the history of humans is this arrogance, and people want to feel superior relative to other people. That is the reason why there is racism. That is the reason why there are all kinds of atrocity throughout human history, why some nations fight other nations, because people feel that small differences are really important and they amplify the significance of that. But if you think about the universe, all of the differences between humans are really completely unimportant, insignificant. We are all roughly the same. And so what's the point? And if people were more modest and humble, when not just when looking at the universe, but relative to each other, then I think we would have had a much better world. And in my book, just to give you an example, I mentioned that Winston Churchill, he in 1939 wrote an essay about the search for extraterrestrial life, but it never got published because he became Prime Minister of England at the time when the Nazis started the Second World War. And if you just think about it, how many lives were lost in the Second World War, and how many resources were wasted just because of racism, just because of one nation trying to establish authority on other nations, and nothing came out of that. And if the same funds, the same money and energy was dedicated to the search for life, like Churchill really wanted before, so just imagine another world where Churchill would publish his essay and everyone would say, great, let's search for that. And the same amount of money, the same energy would be dedicated for that. Then perhaps today we would know the answer.
Those are deep questions and deep, hypotheses and just a direction of knowledge in general. I would also say too, as well, is like, I totally agree because, humans thinking that we're so intelligent and we're still arguing about different phenotypes. I think that's really caveman-like. People are judging, features, and then there's like a lot of tools and systems that have been in place, for hundreds of years that have kind of like created these different, groups, or as we call race. And even the idea of race doesn't really exist except for a human race, but yet we still call ourselves civilized and we still carry these things around. And then there's so many of us that are, they say a race or one race, but we actually are multiple races or mixed within these races that we call races or that we made up. So it's just like, right. What race are you really? So are you saying you're a race, but you're really not this race? You're really mixed up with French. You're really mixed up with Native American, African, or whatever it may be, out of these races that we created.
It's simple. We're all the same. If you look at, there is no reason to make these distinctions at all. It makes zero sense. Why would the color of a skin make any difference to anyone? This is completely superficial kind of thing. And the other thing I wanted to say is about science. There is this sense of people that are in academia, that they are on a pedestal, that they are like lecturers in a class. They should tell the public what to do and this and that. And the way I see science is more, of a way of life. It's not an occupation of the elite. It's not something to be proud of as a status symbol. When someone, when I have a problem with a pipe at my home and a plumber comes along and we are trying to solve the problem by trying to figure out what the origin of the issue is. And it's just like I do my science. We are looking at the clues, at the evidence and figuring it out. And to me, it's nothing different than what I do as a scientist. I regard my life the same way as I regard my scientific work, my occupation. It's a way of life, and therefore I don't feel that I should pretend to know more than I actually know. Most of the time as scientists, we are uncertain, we are unclear about the evidence because there is not enough evidence. So you are trying to collect more evidence and figure it out. And many scientists would say, never speak to the public until you are absolutely sure. But I feel that this is inappropriate because it portrays an image which is not real. The emperor has no clothes. That the real truth is that it's work in progress all the time. And why wouldn't the public appreciate that? If we were honest and say, at the moment, we don't have enough evidence, we don't know for sure, but here is an interesting possibility. Maybe Oumuamua, this object, was an artificial object. So what's the problem in discussing it before we are sure? And of course, there is a way to be sure. If we find another object on its approach to us and we send a spacecraft with a camera that will take a close-up photograph, or maybe even land on it, like OSIRIS-REx, a mission landed on an asteroid Bennu, then you can easily tell the difference between a rock and an artificial object from the photograph. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. In my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book.
Right. Have we done any investigation on this object yet? Have we not done anything? Like, what do we know about this object?
Well, we have data that was we have data that was collected in the few months that it was visible to us. By now, it's already too far away. It's a million times fainter than it was close to us. So we can't get any more data about this object. But, when I go to the kitchen and I find an ant, I usually get alarmed because there must be many more ants out there. So in much the same way, there should be many more objects like it that we will find in the future, either with the same telescope or with another telescope that will become available in 2 years that will be much more sensitive, called the Vera Rubin Observatory in Chile. It could detect an object like Oumuamua once per month. So when you discover additional objects that have also weird properties in the future, you could potentially get much more data about them. Now that we got this wake-up call from Oumuamua, we can be more alert and get more data. And science is guided by evidence. It's not a matter of prejudice. You can't just say, oh, it's always rocks. It's never. You can't say that. You have to examine each and every object that enters the solar system that we find, and see whether it's a plastic bottle or a rock. And if all of them turn out to be natural objects, then okay, I will admit, that is the case. But at the moment, the possibility that some of them would be artificial is real.
That is really interesting because, like, yeah, I think some of the things that I kind of wanted to chime on too as well is like, I think, at a certain point, and I was kind of talking about this earlier, we're looking for these physical objects and, these remnants or these type of archaeological finds that we might find that are physical. But at a certain point, when certain civilizations that may be billions of times more intelligent than we are, do we get rid of the toys, right? Do we get rid of the toys, or do we turn things into spiritual things? And are we, and when we talk about, hey, look, how come we haven't seen exactly these aliens? At a certain point of technology, and I couldn't even imagine a billion years from now, based off of what we've done within the past 50 to 100, is there a point to where, the imagination or the intelligence, whether we've hijacked AI or, we're a hybrid of AI, that we've thought about things, we've kind of gotten, hey, everything's wrong. Everything we've been doing is wrong. We don't need these metal things. We don't need these things. We can use different type of energy sources, or there's things in nature that we can tap onto to actually do some things that we thought could never be possible. I mean, could there also be, extraterrestrial life already walking by us, but we can't see them, right? I mean, because at a certain point of technology, right? Couldn't you? Wouldn't that be something that we would do? That'd be an awesome scientific thing to do, is to be able to walk around and examine, your different species and have them not even see you and walk right by you.
Yeah, definitely. That's a possibility. Another possibility that I thought about during the pandemic is that, if they are advanced enough, they will not be interested in establishing contact with lesser civilizations, because that would degrade their quality of life. So they will close themselves in a cocoon and not show up. And you might think, okay, well, then we will never know about them. I call that social distancing on a cosmic scale. They will be socially distanced from us. We can still learn about them because they have to throw some trash out. And, just like investigative journalists that go through the trash cans of celebrities in Hollywood, we can examine any trash that they throw into space and learn about their private lives. But you are completely right that there may be technologies that we do not recognize because we haven't developed them, and our imagination is quite limited to what we know right now. And we are just 100 years into our technological development. So who knows? I mean, things that might look like magic to us are out there.
Right, and we see things we see things in what, 2 dimensions, or is it 3 dimensions?
3 dimensions, spatial dimensions, and then there is time, of course.
Yes. Right. So therefore, if something sees, in a different type of dimension or more than us, like, would we see them?
That's an excellent question. Now, we don't know if there are more dimensions than 3 spatial, but if there are, maybe they have a way of going there. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a very interesting thought.
Aren't
Yeah.
there hypotheses of like multi dimensions where there's like 13 or 12 and things
Yes.
like that? Do you have any
Yes.
background on understanding those basic logics or fundamentals?
Well, yeah, there is a discussion on extra dimensions, and a theory that tries to unify two pillars, two components of physics. One is quantum mechanics, and the other one is the theory of gravity. There is a theory that tries to bring them together, which is called the string theory, and it does contemplate extra dimensions, in addition to the ones we usually see. And you're right that if there is if these dimensions exist, and if you know how to access them, you might not be visible to the people like us that are familiar only with the three dimensions that we know. So yeah, I mean, a lot can happen that we are not aware of. Definitely, that's an excellent point.
And what do you think about like, guys like Elon Musk who talk about, are we in some type of simulation and things like that?
Yeah,
What's your feedback on that?
I think it's a privilege that someone can have if that someone has a lot of money, because if you have to worry about making a living, you can't engage in such a fantasy, because you realize that, you know, there is a reality out there that you have to work hard in order to make ends meet. And, you can dream about the fact that you have as much money as Elon Musk. But if you go to the ATM and you check how much cash you have in your checking account, you realize that you can't spend as much as Elon Musk can spend. So it's definitely not a simulation, because you're doing an experimental test and you realize, okay, well, I can't just imagine anything I want. And so to me, reality is very real, and I would say that believing it's a simulation is sort of like being high on drugs, like imagining things that we cannot test, that it's sort of a virtual reality. And by the way, there is a way of testing if we are in simulation, because simulations often have a bug. You can see a glitch. I've never seen any pixelation in reality, like that the images look as if they have pixels. When I look out, or in any scientific experiment, there was never a report about pixel size being seen in space and time. So clearly that there is no evidence that the images we see are made of finite resolution elements, pixels. Another way to tell if reality is part of a simulation is if it crashes. Simulation sometimes crashes. I've never seen my reality crash like a simulation. So I would. There are people believing in all kinds of notions, but I prefer to be guided by experience, by evidence. And to me, reality is very real. It's not some hallucination.
I mean, I totally get it, and it makes total sense. But at the same time, one could argue, based off of some of the things you mentioned prior, is that if a civilization or a species or whatever it may be is so far ahead than us, would we see glitches?
Ah, okay. Well, you're saying that they created the simulation that we live in, kind of. Yeah. I mean, again, it's possible, but in the way I evaluate ideas is if you can put skin in the game, in the sense of finding a way of testing the idea, that of ruling it out. So imagining an experiment that will show it wrong. So if you can think of a way of testing this idea that we live in a simulation, and you do the test and you prove that indeed it passes the test, then that's a good that's good idea to embrace. But otherwise, it's just a speculation, and you can make lots of speculations, and we live for such a short time. I prefer to just examine things that can be tested, because that's the only way by which we can make progress. uh, you can always believe in things that can never be tested, that you don't need to put any skin in the game. You don't make a prediction that can be proven wrong, and then you always feel safe, and the idea would survive. There are many cults that develop such ideas, a group of people deciding to believe in something that cannot be tested. So fine, they can agree among themselves and they can have a lifestyle that supports that idea, but it doesn't mean that it's correct.
Totally, totally. So with that question, I'm going to ask you another question. Dig in here. Is are you a religious man? Do you believe in a higher power?
Well, it depends what you call religious, because it depends what God represents. And to me, God does, if there is an entity that you call God, it's, to me, it's more or less identical to nature, the way that Spinoza, a philosopher, believed in. uh, I find nature to be amazing in the sense that it obeys the same laws of physics everywhere. At the edge of the universe, you find things that satisfy exactly the same laws that we uncover here on Earth. And that's unusual, because why would the entire universe, follow the same laws of physics? It's not at all obvious. We establish laws in society, and a lot of people violate them all the time. And when I go to my daughter's rooms in the morning, they look like a mess. They are caught. So why is the universe organized so nicely? And I'm at my work as a scientist brings me very often to be amazed by things in nature that could have been much less organized, much less beautiful, and that gives me a pause. I am not taking it for granted. A lot of physicists would say, okay, well, that's just the way it is. You just need to get used to it. But for me, it's not. I sit back and I think about it, and I'm at awe very often about nature, and that includes also things that I see when I jog in the morning. I see beautiful things every day. This sunrise is different, and it's just amazing. And so I'm pretty much at awe. And you might say, okay, well, religious people also have a sense of awe, and maybe the sense of awe that they have is not very different from the sense of awe that you get as a scientist when looking at nature. But I don't really care, and I don't compare the two senses. But for me, I don't take nature for granted, and I am at awe with respect to nature. So if you call that religious, that's fine with me. But it's not religious in the traditional sense of me believing that there is a God that follows everything I do and acts accordingly. I don't think there is anyone looking over my shoulder. Okay. That used to be the case when I was a kid. There were my parents that were looking over my shoulder. They are not around anymore, but these were humans. It was not some divine entity that. So I recognize that some people have a need. Once they become an adult, they have a need to believe in someone looking over their shoulder, because that's what they were used to as kids. But I don't have that need. I'm willing to confront whatever is in front of me on my own. But
Right.
I'm still at awe with respect to nature.
These are great, 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 great answers and feedback. But I think the thing is like, at what point in life did did it trigger you to, because you said as a young adult, you kind of were religious in some sense, or you believed in some type of
Well, no,
religion,
I
or
follow
no?
tradition. I
Traditional?
follow
Okay.
tradition. I'm Jewish, and
What
I was
changed?
born in Israel. So there's a sense of belonging to some history, the tradition of the Jewish people, and I felt part of it, and I still feel part of it. I'm always proud of where I came from. I never apologize for that, um, and um, uh, but that's more of a cultural thing. You see, that's the way I was brought up. It's not a philosophical thing. It's just the fact that I belong to a certain community of people that have some traditions and some culture, and that's all. But in terms of the bigger question that you asked, believing in God and so forth, that's what we discussed before.
Yeah, those are deep questions, and I think like when you're really trying to think about like religion and you think about God and things like that, I think maybe the interpretation or the explanation of what God is probably fundamentally completely wrong. Where it's just thought of as childlike. I mean, when I like to think of things as far as like God in itself, I always say it's a consciousness that's aware of itself. Which is it is what it is, and that consciousness that's aware of itself is just like, what is your conscience, right? It is what it is. It just is, and out of that consciousness we create.
But there is another possibility, that suppose we were planted here on Earth by another civilization, then you would indeed have that superior power that led to our existence, and we are just calling it God. But in fact, and you can also ask what was there before the Big Bang. If suppose there was a civilization that was able to produce in a laboratory the entire universe, then the umbilical cord of our universe leads to that laboratory, and all the story of the universe being created is true in the laboratory of another civilization that existed before us. And these are possibilities.
But isn't that, I mean, and when you just brought that up, which really triggers which really triggers me to ask something else is like, if that is possible, couldn't that still be the same type of situation of a simulation, right? Because I think it could also be a one and one, right? Because if we're saying that, hey, look, maybe some species created the Big Bang. I mean, could that be a part of the Big Bang simulation, right? Isn't that could be the trigger to start something?
So it's in the same vein that what we see around us was created artificially by a superior technological civilization. Yes, it's the same idea that you had before, and that could include making the Big Bang or creating everything we see around us as reality, being arranged by those beings, in one way or another. Definitely. It's a possibility. And of course, we could, in principle, find out if we find the evidence that they are monitoring us, and that's something in the future.
That would be amazing to do that. But like in what, I wonder what way. I think that goes back into at certain points. And I would also ask you this as well, is like, what do you think the meaning of life is in general for you?
Yeah. So as I said before, we are born into this world without anyone telling us what this play is about. We are actors put on a stage without a script. And it's the most fundamental question. What is the meaning of life? And all the meanings that we give to our lives are on the surface of Earth. We love a person, we establish a family, we have aspirations for jobs and so forth. It's all on the surface of Earth. And as we discussed, eventually, the sun will boil off all the oceans on Earth, and everything that we assign to Earth will not be meaningful anymore. So in the long run, all the meanings that we give to our lives will be meaningless. It will be ancient history. The Earth would not exist a billion years from now. So what was the point of us doing everything we did? It will be completely erased. And if you're looking for a deeper meaning, then perhaps the question to ask is, who else is out there? Is it possible that we arrived here on Earth and what we have around us is a result of another civilization that created these conditions? If we find evidence for them, or maybe they know, they are smarter than we are. Maybe they know what this play is about. Maybe they know more, or maybe there is no meaning. That's the other possibility, that there is no absolute meaning. You just have to enjoy your life. You have to enjoy the food you eat. You have to enjoy good friends, and it will never be very deep. You will just enjoy whatever you're doing, and that will be the meaning that you will give to your life.
Or what about this? What about this? What about this theory? What about if we're just here, as a vacation? What if there's another dimension where we just like we're looking down and we have these type of ways of getting out or going out to have a vacation, and then we say, hey, let's go visit Earth. I want to live life again. And randomly we get to choose parents, and then we choose those parents and we forget where we were because that totally kills the game, right? So these are part of the rules. And then we manifest here, and then we go through life trying to remember how do we get here, and and then we kind of make these goals within our lives to kind of solve things, and and at the end of the actual game, we learn something and we grow, and then maybe we do it again or maybe we don't. But
the only problem with that idea is that it doesn't always feel like a vacation. Most of the time when we live through life, it feels like a struggle. It's actually painful.
Yeah, but and I think that's interesting. But maybe a part of that vacation is also a lesson. Maybe it's a lesson.
Yeah,
Maybe
it
maybe
would
we
be
go
fun.
through life uniquely for certain lessons, and then when we learn those lessons, we go back to where we go. And then if we want to go back again, maybe we go back again. But maybe that's a part of the game rules. Maybe the vacation cannot be permanent, total vacation. Maybe there's some pros and cons within that, and we know that before we come into the game.
That's a fun thought. I agree. Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Again,
we just
I
don't
would
know.
say, yeah, these are good ideas. But again, as a scientist, I should say that I feel responsible that whenever I provide an idea for a situation, I can also think about a way of showing that it's wrong,
Yes,
and
pros and cons.
it's testable. And I should tell you that a lot of my colleagues, scientists that work in the mainstream right now, they don't feel that need. They don't feel that they need to put some skin in the game. People are working on things like string theory, extra dimensions, without actually proposing a way to test their ideas. And I think in a way that's unfortunate, because the only way for us to make progress is by checking whether what we think about is right or wrong. And it's just like going to the ATM and checking whether we have as much money as Elon Musk.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's interesting, but at the same time, as a person of science, and I'll even go into it because I think like any curious person is a scientist, right? I think any curious person is a scientist. I mean, I remember even being as a child, that was something that I always wanted to be, was a scientist or an archaeologist or an inventor. So I would just create wacky, crazy stuff all the time around my house, and my mom would kind of, want to pull her hair out, like, what is this guy doing? Like, why is he hooking wires up and he's got.
Why don't you become a scientist now?
So here's the thing, I was like, you know what, I want to be an archaeologist. I didn't know if I wanted to be some type of biologist. I didn't know if I wanted to even do, some of the things that you were doing. So I was kind of confused on that because I was interested in all of those at the same time. And I was going to go for archaeology, but then I was like, you know what, it feels like you have to raise money to do these expeditions. Right. And, I was like, maybe that's better for me when I'm older. And so I was like, let me find something else. Oh, no.
Never too late. You can do it now. By the way, I wrote my book. I told the publisher when I wrote my book that I will be satisfied if one person around the world, after reading my book, will decide to become a scientist. That was my goal. And I have to say that I'm satisfied now, because I got an email from Malawi from a woman that said, your book is great, and I'm now aspiring to be, after reading it, to become an astronomer. And I said, that's great. Why don't you apply to our graduate program at Harvard? That would be wonderful. And I had an email from Colombia in Latin America, where
Colombia, yeah.
another graduate student said that reading the book changed her life. And so, I get those emails every day, and that makes me very happy, because I do think that a lot of people are capable of being scientists. It's just that they do not follow the path. And it would be wonderful if people without prejudice, open-minded, being open-minded and coming from very different places and walks of life will enter science. I was not planning to become a scientist. I grew up on a farm. I collected eggs every afternoon, and just circumstances led me to become a scientist. And I'm not the typical scientist you find at the university, but I enjoy it because it allows me to learn new things about the world. It's just fun to be a scientist, and science can be exciting. It doesn't need to be boring, as it always looks. So I very much hope that more young people will get into science, and that our society will invest in science. That's the most precious thing we have in moving forward. All of our technologies, the cell phones, the communication, the internet, all of that came from science that was originally was not even for a particular application. It was just trying to understand the world. And so it's the best thing that society can have, and we should put more money into it than we put into fighting other nations or things like that.
And that's a great question. And it's like, when you think about things like that, and you talk about the world and education and where they need to be and things like that, and science and things like that. It's like, how do we scale, more, humans into doing things within the science realm? Because the future seems like this is the only path, but we're still teaching people to be singers and models and, all this other stuff like that. And it's like, there's bigger problems, to solve. There's so many great things. Like, what are we doing here? We barely know the oceans.
Right. I think, well, first thing is for us to focus on working together. You know, the big message of science is collaboration, working together. Science, I call it an infinite sum game. You know, in economics, there is a zero sum game. If someone benefits, another person loses in the stock market, or it happens quite a bit. And so in science, everyone wins. If you gain more knowledge, everyone can benefit from it. So it's an infinite sum game. The more you know, the more you can expand your knowledge, and it's based on cooperation. You know, so if, for example, it would have been possible for scientists to get into China when the virus came out, you know, when
COVID. Yeah.
COVID erupted, then we would have perhaps developed vaccines much faster. And sharing information, sharing knowledge is for the benefit of everyone. And I think, you know, the one lesson that science teaches you is that working together can help us get to a better place, you know, and a better future. And that is the intelligent way for us to work, rather than being competitive and always trying to show that we are superior relative to others, which is what most people do most of the time, you know. And I very much hope, you know, I'm trying to bring this message through my book and through, I had of over 500 interviews over the past few months, and that's really what drives me, this message.
And I think that's really interesting. But like, I don't know. I think like I think the whole being a scientist and into these certain fields and disciplines is beginning to be a little bit more trendier or acceptable. Because I remember as a kid, before terraforming was like a big thing. I would think about like how could you terraform Mars as a kid. As a little kid, I would do that. And I would think like, what are the basic elements to create life? And I'd set up a jar and I'd put water and then I'd put some, sand, and then I'd put some algae in there, and I would just sit it in there and close the bottle next to the window and just let it. Before terraforming was like a thing that was talked about, I would think about Mars, and I would think about like how could we terraform Mars before it was like a thing. And I would literally, I'd grab, a ragu jar and empty it out, clean it, and I would grab some sand and I'd grab some algae and I'd drop some water in it and I would screw it tight and I'd put it in the window and have it facing towards the sun, and I kept it there for like 2 years. And then I would see little things, organisms moving around and wiggling and stuff like that, and then these weird little things were growing out of it. And I was just like, because I was thinking like, how could that be possible? Like, how could we terraform something from these basic elements? And I wanted just to see, and I'm pretty sure there were some errors in what I did because I didn't take things that were completely pure. But I just wanted to manipulate and see if something like that could be possible of some sense, and what were those elements that would need to make that happen. I would see fog rising towards the top of the glass, and and I was like, man, is that kind of similar to what a cloud would be, or like what does that look like? Like, could you explain like
It sounds like you should have become a scientist for sure, and it's not too late. I think you should.
I mean, right now, I don't know if I've told you a little bit about some of the things that I do in my background right now.
Mhm.
I've been a senior product designer for the last couple of years. So, basically what I do is, I research, I build products based off of psychology and iterate them. And, I solve problems. That is what I do. So a hint of what I do is a science, it's technology. So it is a science, but it's just not used in the other ways. I think I would consider more hard science. I haven't done those. And I actually did have a startup for about 4.5 years. And, there was one other kid that was under me, and he was a co-founder. And he actually, we split up and did our own different things. He actually started teaching at Harvard and became a student.
Oh,
So,
interesting. Yeah, so here's an example, right? So it's never too late.
never
You
is,
see?
never is. Yeah, but I just always thought that was interesting. But we would talk about, school in Harvard, and he actually, met up with a professor there and told him about the startup that we did, and that also helped him give him a recommendation to being in Harvard.
Well, you just talked with a professor there right now. So,
Oh,
and
there.
and that professor is telling you that it's not too late. And by the way, I was not planning to become a scientist, and I could have ended in a completely different place. And circumstances brought me to that, and that's why
What was those
tried to.
circumstances?
I was originally, well, I grew up on a farm, so that was always an option for me to raise chicken and grow oranges, and but I was interested in intellectual pursuit, and I was interested in philosophy mostly because that's where the big questions are. And uh, when I met with philosophers late in my career, they told me that I made a good choice because even though philosophy addresses very fundamental questions, you can't really resolve them. They're too difficult, and there is no consensus about the answers. And science makes progress. We can build things out of understanding science. And so in a way, I'm sort of happy that I ended up where I am. And but I'm still trying to help students and young people in reaching their ambitions in science, and irrespective of whether they come from unprivileged backgrounds. And 80% of my students were over the past decade were women, and many from underrepresented minorities. And I simply feel an obligation because I myself was not, there must have been a lot of people like me that did not have the same special circumstances that allowed them to get to where I am. And so I was lucky in some way, and I feel obligated to help younger
But
people.
what was the trigger though that kind of made you say, I want to be this type of scientist? Like what was like what
Well, it was circumstances, because in Israel you have to serve in the military, and
right.
I prefer to do intellectual work rather than run in the field. So there was a possibility to pursue physics because it's useful for the defense of the country. And so I was recruited for a program that allowed me to finish my PhD actually in physics and mathematics. And I developed a project that was funded by the US, the Star Wars initiative of Ronald Reagan that you are wearing. Yeah. And that's what brought me to the US. And then I visited Princeton and was offered a 5-year fellowship if I will switch to astrophysics. So it was all by chance. And then Harvard offered me a junior faculty position. Nobody wanted it because the chance of getting tenure were very small. And I was tenured 3 years later. And so I found myself just like being married through an arranged marriage. It was not my intention to get there. But I'm married actually to my true love, because the nice thing about astrophysics is that it addresses fundamental questions using the scientific method. And that is a very good place to be in. But it makes me very different from my colleagues because of my history, because my path was very untypical.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, your path was, and what's so interesting is this touches on what I was talking about previously. And if you look at your life and your path, it seems like there were certain, moments within your life that kind of led you to where you are right now. And like they were like almost like creepy, almost coincidentally odd that they kind of interlocked to make you who you are and to put you on this exact path. So with that being
Right.
said, I'm like, at a certain point, like, is everything just a, probability and randomness and chaos? Even throughout chaos, there is a pattern, and you shake something up in a ball, and it kind of lands and does something. So it's like, what does that look like? And I think that's really interesting. But I want to know, why did you write these books? Like, what pushed you to write these books? These are amazing books, but what made you do them?
Well, the last book, Extraterrestrial, the one that we discussed, I wrote it because the subject of finding relics of other civilizations is so important for the future of humanity. And we can just we must examine it scientifically. We cannot ignore it, and I think we have the tools now, and that should be a part of the mainstream of science. So I felt very strongly about that. I also felt that it's important to communicate that science is, exciting. And so putting these together led to the last book. Previous books that I wrote were more about specific scientific areas, like, for example, the scientific version of the story of Genesis, how the first light was produced in the universe, and black holes and stuff like that. But here, I think this is really the most important question that we can ask as scientists, which is, are we the smartest kid on the block?
Right. I mean, I think that's interesting. And when you start thinking about, are we the smartest kid in the block? It's just like it's a big question because it's like, what is smart? What is intelligence? What is consciousness? And you can just keep on digging, digging, and digging, and then it's like, can our brain even comprehend that? I mean, like, we don't even use majority of our brain, so it's like, what is that? What is the rest of your brain for? Like, there's a lot of deep questions that seem like we're built to do things, but like certain things were set up to be turned off, or for whatever reason there may be. But it's just like, can we fathom a lot of these queries that we kind of like ponder on? Like, can we fathom them exactly? Like, is our brain intelligent enough to actually comprehend some of the things that we're trying to say, and then cross-examine like some of these theories and pros and cons within our brain capacity in general? Is that possible?
Well, that's an excellent question, but I think an even better question is: are we improving? And if you compare us to the way humans were 100,000 years ago, we are certainly much more intelligent than they were. Our brain size is bigger, and we are doing things that they were unable to even contemplate. So let's hope that as we move towards the future, we get smarter and smarter.
But when we say humans, like, at what point are we talking about? Are we talking about Homo sapiens, or are we talking about
Yes,
when
Homo
some
sapiens.
of us like hybrided with Neanderthals and things like that, and Denisovans?
Well, so I think at every step along the way, we gained abilities. And the point is that it's not the end of the road for us. The question is, how much more time do we have into the future? And that's something I addressed in an essay that I wrote this morning, just before I went out to jog. I sent an essay to Scientific American on this question of how much time we have left. And, there is a much smaller chance of you to find yourself as a baby that was just born on the first day of after birth, and there is a 10,000 times more likelihood that you are in the middle of your life, that you are an adult, simply because that is a much longer period of time than the first day of life. And the same is true. If the same is true for our technological civilization, we have been developing technologies for about a century. So if you say, okay, we are most likely to be adults right now, not babies, and therefore we cannot be part of a technological lifespan that lasts millions of years. Most likely we have a few more centuries to go. That's it, because we're in the middle of our life right now. That is a rather gloomy forecast. We don't have a lot of time left. And if you see the effects we have on climate and so forth, it may well be real that we don't have a lot of time. So my point is, if we think about it, we will need to venture into space. We will need to go and explore other places, because it's not clear that conditions on Earth will stay as hospitable as they are right now. And you have to think about the big picture. And just like Oscar Wilde said, all of us are in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars.
Brilliant. And I would ask a question on that. If we're talking about, and I wanted to bring it back to a question or something we talked about previously, where you were talking about, or we were kind of bringing up of like, if aliens exist, how come they kind of haven't like shown up at our front door? And you brought up some other things that maybe were just like ants. What other what other type of like other reasons might they not show themselves to us?
Well, most of the stars are smaller than the sun, and they emit infrared light. They are much cooler than the sun. And you can imagine that other creatures out there have infrared eyes. I teach a freshman seminar at Harvard, and I ask the students to come up with an animal that has infrared eyes on Earth. And one of them brought an image of a shrimp that has infrared eyes. It has, the eyes look like ping pong balls connected with the cord to the head of the shrimp. So it looks just like an alien. So if you imagine creatures with infrared eyes, any interstellar tourist agencies will never advertise the Earth as a desired destination, because all we can offer them are, in our vacation sites, are sites with green grass illuminated by visible light from the sun, and they are used to infrared light and red dark grass. So they will never come to visit us. We will have to go there and entice them to visit us. So that's one reason for
I mean,
perhaps.
but what about like also? I mean, because there's ancient Native Americans who talk about reptilians being under the ground. There was the one forgot his name where he passed away. He said that he traveled underneath the ground helping to do some stuff for the government. He was contracted. And then he said he ran across some reptilians, and I'm sure you've heard this story. And he supposedly his hands were lasered off, and he kind of showed him like in his little YouTube video and stuff like that, with his hands being chopped off and things like that. Like,
Well,
what
these
do you
are
think
just
about those things? You
yeah.
think those are like is that jokes, or you think those are real?
No, I think these are probably fairy tales. I mean, the point is scientific evidence is all about reproducibility. You have to be able to reproduce the results. And there are all kinds of reports about unidentified flying objects, aerial phenomena, about people having experiences. We need to reproduce them. And there is a way to reproduce them. But if you were to place cameras that we have now, which are far better quality than the cameras that used to exist decades ago when those Pentagon reports were filmed, then we can test whether in the same locations you see anything unusual. So it's not a question of believing people when they tell you something. The question is really reproducing what they are talking about through instruments that are reliable. Because if you look at the Old Testament, the Bible, there is this story of Abraham that heard the voice of God telling him to sacrifice his only son, Isaac.
Right.
And if Abraham had a cell phone with a voice memo app, he could have pressed the button and recorded the voice of God. And then, we wouldn't need to believe his story. We could have listened to the recording. And unfortunately, he didn't have a cell phone. So, there are all kinds of stories that you have to decide whether to believe them or not. And I'm much more in favor of evidence that can be reproduced. And my point is all these UFO reports, we can do scientific experiments and check whether there is anything unusual out there.
What type of scientific experiments can we do? Because if they're also like technologically, higher than us, right? Like, couldn't they avoid cameras and different things like that?
Yeah, you can put scientific equipment like state-of-the-art cameras and audio sensors in the same locations where the reports came from, and see if you detect anything unusual.
But what if you just if a civilization is so much more intelligent than us, couldn't they bypass our cameras and our technology? If we're that primitive, we're ants, right?
So, well, in that case, then if it's not reproducible, then there is no evidence that you can trust.
Right. And so it's like, what if something wanted to do that? What if something wanted to not be traceable?
Yeah. So then we will not have the evidence. Yeah, in that case. Mm-hmm.
So then there would just be this binary, we don't believe,
Yes.
and then there's just we've seen these things, which could be very possible that they might not want to know. And then also, is there thing is like, Avi, would the government allow these things to be widespread? When we have things like COVID being hidden.
I don't believe in any conspiracy because I don't think the government is able to seal all evidence. Astronomers are looking at the sky all the time, and so the government is interested in those reports because they may represent technologies that other nations use for espionage. So if there are reports of unusual things, you want to check them. But other than that, the government has no interest in scientific questions like the existence of alien civilization.
So you think the government just like doesn't even believe in these type of things, and it's kind of comical to them in a way?
I don't think there is any agenda behind hiding. The only issue is national security of potentially other nations having technologies we don't know about.
That's really interesting. And when you think about things in space, like how big is space? Like, is there ending to space? Because we were talking earlier about space in how that there's an end or there's edges to it. Like, how does that make sense? Like, how do you know there's an end or a beginning?
Well, we can see only a finite distance, which is the distance that light traveled since the Big Bang. So we can only see a certain volume around us, and we call it the observable universe. And we don't know beyond that distance what is out there, because we can't see any light coming from greater distances. So all we know is within the distance that light traveled since the Big Bang, since the beginning of the expanding universe.
And what makes light?
Light?
Yeah, what makes light? Like we know stars are, illuminate light, but like how do they make light?
Well, there are charged particles that emit light. For example, atoms or electrons can emit light under some circumstances. In the early universe, conditions were very hot, so particles were bumping against each other and creating light. And there was this radiation relic from the Big Bang that is called the cosmic microwave background that we detect from the early time that is left behind. And it tells us the universe was very hot to start with.
Awesome. And I think my last question is time travel possible?
Not according to what we know as of now, but it's something to be explored. And some scientists argue that time travel is not possible because you get into logical inconsistencies. For example, if you can go back in time and eliminate the conditions that led to the birth of your parents, then you shouldn't exist. And how is that possible for you to go back in time? And so some physicists say that it's not possible to build a time machine because it leads to inconsistencies. And we don't know the answer, whether it's possible or not. At the moment, there is no way that we can design some device that will allow us to go back in time.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So pretty much, all right. So we think that basically the reason why we believe it's not possible because we can go back and change and adjust certain things. And so therefore it shouldn't be possible.
Right. And that would not be consistent. It will just not allow us. You can imagine pulling the trigger on your grandparents and then it would mean that you don't exist. So how is that possible that you went back in time and generated conditions that do not allow you to exist? That's a logical inconsistency. And so some people would argue, well, maybe you cannot pull the trigger, when you go back in time. And but at the moment, I should say that there is no way that physicists can contemplate that they will allow you to build a machine that takes you back in time.
Awesome. That's great. So I think, it's been a great conversation, but where can we find where can people find, some of your books and your work, and what are some recommendations that you would tell the audience out there to, check out?
So everything about me is on my website at Harvard University. You just put my name in Google, Avi Loeb, A-V-I-L-O-E-B. And my latest book, Extraterrestrial, is available in any bookstore. And there are also some videos and news articles that are linked on my website. And just in general, I am now working on my next book. And if anyone has questions, feel free to send me an email.
And what's the next book basically roughly about?
To be decided.
Ooh, I like that. So I can't wait to hear about that. But Avi, it's been great to have you on the show. Definitely excited about this and had a great conversation. I'm definitely going to read more in your book. I got it yesterday and I was reading through it and I wanted to dig in more and ask you some more questions about it, but I'm definitely going to read that one and can't wait for your next one.
Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yes, may the force be with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Kids in the Room podcast. Kids in the Room podcast.
That's right. That's right.
Brought to you by Move Faces TV. Let's go.